Yesterday there was the occasion to have tea with a very dear friend who does what we have to call wonderful spiritual work. But she related that she'd been angry for the last few days. She said she'd received an email from a friend who was not consciously spiritual. And when she sat down to make the reply to this friend, she was impelled to write paragraphs and paragraphs, no doubt in a spiritual way. 3 times she deleted this email, saying to herself, you can't send an email like this to someone who is not openly spiritual. But in the end, she was compelled to write that email. And it reminded me of several little Sufi stories. But first of all, let's be reminded of that old Zen story of the samurai who's walking down the road. He's battle-scarred and bloodied and wearied, and he encounters an old monk. And he stops the monk and he says, in his weary way, to the monk, "Monk, tell me, if there is a hell, is there also a heaven?" The monk eyed the samurai up and down and fixed him with a piercing gaze, saying, "You, a samurai? Look at you. You look more like a peasant to me, and that sword of yours couldn't even cut off the head of an ant." Well, the blood came into the samurai's eyes, and he took out his sword and he put it at the throat of the monk, and the monk looked at him calmly and said, "That's hell." In that moment, the samurai had a realization. In looking at this old monk with his staff, he became aware that this old man was willing to die to bring him truth. Tears started to roll down the samurai's face, and he fell down on his knees in front of the old monk. And the old monk looked at him and gently said, "And that's heaven." Now, the first Sufi story is about a group of travelers who were on a ferry, but a storm came along, a great storm, and the ferry began to rock and was in great danger of capsizing. And everyone on the ferry got down on their knees to importune Allah to save them, save us. But then they noticed that there was a dervish amongst them who was sitting over in a corner, quietly munching an apple, seemingly oblivious to the storm and all that was going on. So they approached him and asked him, why was he not praying? And the dervish said, "Well, I have long ceased not to be concerned about the ways of Allah." And they asked him, "Well, how did you come to this?" He said, "Well, I heard a story about another dervish. One day this dervish was sitting in contemplation when one of those dung beetles walked by. And this dervish had the thought, how could Allah create such a filthy, abominable creature?" And the very next day, the dervish came down with a severe and very strange malady. He went to physicians, he went to soothsayers, but no cure could be found. And finally, he went to his Sufi sheikh, and the Sufi sheikh said to the dervish, "Have you not yet learned that the ways of Allah are many, and there is a purpose for all things under heaven?" And with that, the sheikh took down some dead dung beetles that he had on a shelf and put them in a mortar and pestle and gave them to the dervish to drink. Now, with great trepidation, the dervish drank the potion that had been given to him by his sheikh and was instantly relieved of his malady. He said, "Since this time, I have had no question about the ways of Allah." And then the second very simple Sufi story is about another sheikh who took a group of his dervishes on a picnic. And after they had laid out their picnic fare, he asked the dervishes to go to collect some flowers. Now each of them went off and gathered the most beautiful blooms that they could find. But then there was one dervish who came back with only a dead stem. Now all the other dervishes pointed the finger at him and laughed at him and called him Abdal, Abdal, which means fool in Turkish. Sheikh said, "Ah yes, Abdal is a very appropriate name to call this friend. Because ask him now why it is that he brought back merely a stem." The dervish said, "I went around to all the wildflowers, and as I listened, they were all singing praises to Allah. But then I came across this stem that had finished its prayers, so I brought it along." "Ah," said the sheikh, "Abdal in its deepest meaning means one who has totally surrendered to the will of Allah." In relating this anecdote and these stories, we can ask, what is that we've found in our lives that is greater than our doubts, our fears, whatever conditioning might be left after all our cleansing and purification? What is that force that in these stories is called the will of Allah, that now compels us and is greater than any trepidation we might feel about undertaking a task, responding to an inquiry, answering an email? What is this? It's been asked in another way. What is it that's evoked when stillness and movement meet? But now, since we recognize that when stillness and movement meet, there is something that arises, that enacts as a response to the perceptions of life, can therefore be described as a force, a power. Isn't it so? What is it then? What is it then that's greater than our conditioning, trepidations, our fears, that allows us now to respond and do and say whatever it is that's there to be done and said. Put it together with the stories of the past, the recognition that now, with this state of just being present, aware, still, even, and the movement of life, the perceptions entering into that, not the other way around now. What is this force that arises in response to the inward pouring of life? Because it is an inward pouring. This is like a vessel, this body. The perceptions go in, pass down the channels, just like when we imbibe a glass of water, glass of wine. There's a process that is gone through. What is this? Can you give it a name? Can you describe it? What will you say to people when they ask you, just like the question to the dervish, well, why are you sitting there when everybody else is praying? The response is different to what they would get from someone else. Normally a platitude, or why did you do that, or
it's knowing when we surrender even to what I could call still a fear, but there's no fear of the fear. There's a knowledge of expansion as a feeling, as a knowing that it's God's will, and in that we are going a bit deeper. It's true. So there's no more fear of being there. But
Yes.
so I know.
Yes.
So there's no choice to take to have good fun.
No.
It's just to let everything happen.
No.
In surrendering.
Yes.
And knowing now for sure that it's bringing the space.
Yes. So bring it back to that little anecdote about the friends yesterday. What was the anger? Why was she angry?
She questioned.
She questioned. She was fighting it, rebellious, wasn't it?
She didn't surrender.
Yeah. And of course, no, I'm not going to say that. You know what that is? What happens when you pent up energy? When you tamp it down, when you squash it back?
It explodes.
Yeah. Gives you a pain in the belly for a start, isn't it?
And who are we to question the response of the other person to whatever we
Whatever
say?
it is, yes.
Right.
But because of course now this friend is machinating over, haven't heard from what effect it's had. Not our business, is it? No, we don't. But describe it we must.
It's like when you're cruising around, a passenger in a car that God's driving,
Yes,
and you get out of that car, that's when the anger.
that's when the anger, absolutely it
So
does.
you
We know
stay
it.
in that car and
It
everything's fine.
certainly does, yes. Certainly does. So we can see what happens if we're not true to that process. Perception going in, response arising if we tamp that down, blocked up energy. We need to give it a name. We need to That's what it is, all right. That is and that's a response too.